This podcast is brought to you by ProLongevity, the award-winning 8-week program that transforms the lives of people with diabetes, pre-diabetes and many other illnesses. Founded by me, Graham Phillips, the pharmacist who gave up drugs.
So I think generally it's accepted now that there's more to all of this, even by the orthodoxy, that there's a bit more to all of this than saturated fat. But if you're going to carry on with this kind of diet heart hypothesis, you have to keep iterating it, don't you? Because as you knock it down, either you abandon the hypothesis or you find some other alternative way of explaining it. And the current vogue has got to do with Ldl Low-Density Lipoprotein, which people call bad cholesterol, but it isn't actually cholesterol, although it contains some. So the theory goes that it's the LDL that causes the problem, and that's the statins correct the LDL and solve the problem. So let's talk a bit about that, because I'd always struggled to understand how LDLs could be the cause of the problem and end up in arterial walls. But you've kind of explained it in such a fundamentally comprehensible way that makes you realise actually it was a ludicrous idea in the first place. So let's describe what they're saying happens, and then let's go on to say actually why scientifically this isn't just unlikely, it's completely impossible.
No. Well, the hypothesis is obviously if you have more LDLs, you've got raised LDL numbers of molecules in your bloodstream, that they will travel through the lining of the heart. All blood vessels are lined by a single cell layer called an endothelial cell. Anyway, that they transported through this cell into the artery wall behind and gradually build up into thickenings, a bit like you said. You can look at thickenings in pipes or something where fat and fatbergs are created. So essentially what you're seeing is basically LDL just being deposited in the walls of blood vessels. These are the thickenings that they call atherosclerotic plaques or atherosclerosis. These thickenings gradually get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they become a sort of vulnerable point where a large blood clot forms that blocks the entire blood vessel and causes a heart attack or a stroke. That is it. That is the hypothesis, I think.
And on, just like the fat in the bottom of the frying pan, on the face of it, that seems reasonable and plausible, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And there's a certain amount of circumstantial evidence that if you look at it from the right direction, standing on one leg, makes some sense. But it's simply impossible. And you're going to explain, as you do so elegantly in the book, you're going to explain why it's impossible.
In under 30 seconds. Well, the cells that line all your blood vessels, endothelial cells, are just like any other cell. They carefully control what gets into them and what gets out of them. Cells can control the passage of single atoms. So you'll have heard of medics and physiologists and whatever, have heard of things like calcium channels or sodium channels and potassium channels. And these are basically things that allow single ions, which are charged atoms, to move in and out of the cell. You can't get them in and out unless the cell wants them in there or out of there. And it will pump things out and suck things in depending on what its needs are. And LDL themselves, you can't get an LDL into a cell unless the cell wants it to be in. So in order to facilitate this, it creates an Ldl receptor, which we think of as maybe like an egg cup. It takes the egg cup, shoves it out the side of the cell into the bloodstream. A passing LDL molecule is attracted to the egg cup because the LDL's got a protein on it that is attracted. So there's a lock and key mechanism, if you like. There's a mechanism that recognizes it. So the Ldl receptor and the LDL molecule lock onto each other, and they are then the whole thing is pulled back into the cell. The LDL molecule itself is then broken down, and the cell uses the cholesterol and the fatty acids and whatever is within it for the purposes that it so requires. At that point, normally the Ldl receptor itself is broken down as well, so it no longer exists. So we therefore know that the only way you can get an LDL into a cell is if the cell wants it in and creates an Ldl receptor for it. The idea that a concentration gradient builds up in some way and that forces LDL into a cell is incomprehensibly stupid. Physiology says that can't happen. It can't happen. There isn't a concentration gradient issue here. Yes, if you raise the level of something astronomically high in the bloodstream, like your sodium level, you can cause the cell to basically blow up through osmotic pressure. But I mean, other than that, the cells will control it. But the hypothesis currently is that the LDL is plucked from the bloodstream with the receptor. The LDL molecule then separates from the LDL receptor, travels through the cell, arrives at the other side of the cell, and this would be approximately the journey for a human being of walking half a mile on basic scale. It then arrives at the other side of the cell, and the cell does what? Creates an inside-out LDL receptor, locks onto the LDL and pops it out the other side. Well, these mechanisms of transporting things across cells do exist, but not for LDL, they certainly don't. Yeah. And it's highly complicated. It's a controlled structure. And we already know that, for instance, in your brain, that the brain cannot transport LDL from the bloodstream into the brain because there's a barrier function in the brain that stops this happening.
For a very good reason.
Function is the LDL cells, because the brain doesn't want stuff getting into it. It doesn't want it because it's very vulnerable. So that approach doesn't work. The next approach is to say, oh, well, the LDL sneaks between the cells. And you go, right, well, that if you don't understand anything about cells, then you can make that comment.
Just to break off, because this is quite complicated. So there's a principle, and this principle applies to all living things, all cells, even primitive single cellular organisms. And that is that of homeostasis. And that is the incredibly tight control of the internal environment of the cell. So you have a cell membrane and nothing gets in normal circumstances without the express permission of the cell through a receptor. There's a mechanism that allows stuff in and a mechanism that allows stuff out. And once you're inside the cell, you don't just sort of float around doing things at will. The cell controls what goes on, and it will generally dismantle anything that comes in, use it up and recycle it. So the idea here is that these LDLs are, these bad damaged LDLs are floating around in the bloodstream. They kind of barge their way into a cell, no mechanism to that. And then they somehow make their way across the river Nile to the other side and emerge at the other side intact and do some damage on the other side of the riverbank. Which if you think about it in a very lay way, you could kind of envision it. But when you understand the fundamental science of cell biology, you realize there simply is no mechanism for stuff to just meander into cells, wander intact across the cell, and end up in the opposite cell wall to cause damage. None of the mechanisms exist. And if they did, we'd be dead.
Yes. Well, we would be dead, because if we can't control, that's the function of life, is the homeostasis, control of your internal milieu is the word. If cells lose control of their internal milieu, we know what happens. They die. That is what happens. It's almost the definition of death. You lose control of what is going on within your own cell. And cells are, they're not as big as us, obviously. They're minute, but they still are incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
Almost organisms, if you like. I mean, the cells that make up the lining of your blood vessels are almost identical to what they call white blood cells, which are things that can actually crawl about inside your body and move around. So they're very, very, they're one step away from an amoeba, if you like.
Yeah.
So they're very, very, very complex organisms.
So I stopped you at the point where we were saying, okay, we accept that there's no LDL receptor that enables something to go into the cell, swim through the cell and swim out, and pop out the other side and do damage. And therefore, okay, we're going to just say, all right, so we'll have another go at this. What we'll say is it goes down the gaps between the cells. And I stopped you at that point. So that also doesn't fly. And again, you're about to explain why.
Well, cells, again, they have to control very carefully what gets between them, because again, if they didn't control that, then everything could just move in and around all the tissues of the body. And once again, essentially, your body would just burst. It is complicated stuff going on inside there. So in order to stop this happening, cells are linked together by what they call protein bridges, like really complicated. It's like filaments of protein that link together, then cross over and then hold in. It's like having a zip and buttons and Velcro, and then someone cements it together as well, just to make sure it's absolutely cemented together. because it's a requirement for life to have these barriers between the cells. So nothing can go, and this is known. I mean, there are journals called tissue barrier. There is a journal called Tissue Barriers, which describes tissue barriers and cell membrane barriers. So this is not like just, oh, I've just made this up. And you can see them. You can see them under a microscope. You can see there is no way for anything to travel between the cells either. You know, cells are essentially terraced houses. They are locked together. They may be separate houses, but if you looked at them from the outside, you wouldn't know where they join together. They are locked together, and they have to be. And that's how the life exists, in fact. It allows the control not only of the internal cell environment, the milieu, the homeostasis, but also the environment between, say, the bloodstream and all the tissues behind it, which have to be protected. So this is just basic physiology, which is, none of this is not accepted. I'm not saying anything here that anyone could argue with at all.
Anyone who, even O-level biology, would tell you this much, right?
Maybe A-level. But yeah, it is pretty much, it's like, you know, it's a bit like saying we've got bones inside our body. I know you can't see them, but they're there. Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, it is basic stuff, which just seems to have been completely ignored, essentially.
So we've explained that there's no such thing as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, and why that is. And we've kind of, I mean, there's much more in the book. I would encourage people to read the book, because you explain it so well, and there's a limit to how much detail we can go into in a podcast. But I think we've probably given people enough to make them question this whole LDL thing, because when you explain it in the way that you just have, it makes no sense. So we've kind of talked about what doesn't happen. And what I'd like to do now is explore what does happen, because cardiovascular disease exists. It's still the major killer. It's a huge concern, and something drives it. So let's now talk through a plausible mechanism of the cause of cardiovascular disease.
Right. Well, it's been 35 years of diving down rabbit holes and getting lost in variously complicated places, because it is complicated. Well, it's complicated in one way. There's lots of complications. It's a bit like saying E equals MC squared, there you are, and then going, right, well, there's quite a lot behind that, actually. It's a kind of a very simple idea, but essentially what you're looking at in this world is, and it's not a new hypothesis, it's been around for 170 years, is that the arteries, and the arteries specifically, because remember, you never get atherosclerosis in veins, even though they have the same LDL level, etc. So it's only in larger arteries we're talking about. So essentially, what happens is that the lining of the artery, which is, as I've said before, these endothelial cells, they become damaged. Now they're either stripped off or they just become damaged. That triggers a blood clot to form at that point. Not necessarily a very big blood clot. It might be so small you might only see it under a microscope, for example. But anyway, a blood clot forms because it's triggered by, once you've exposed the underlying artery to the bloodstream, that is a very powerful clarion call for blood clotting. We know this. Again, this is sort of clot physiology 101. So as blood clot forms on top of that area, now obviously it can't just keep getting bigger and bigger, otherwise every time a blood clot formed you'd have a heart attack or a stroke. So it stops forming almost as quickly as it starts, but you're still left with a problem. You have a blood clot stuck to the artery wall. What do you do with it? Well, you can't just let it break off and travel further down the artery, because you're going to get a heart attack or a stroke further down, and problems will occur. So it has to be dealt with at that point. Now, you know, if you scratch your skin, you'll get some bleeding, or if you scrape your skin, you'll get some bleeding, and then a clot will form on top of the skin. But actually what happens to the skin is that the skin cells grow up from underneath, because they can, and they push the clot off, and eventually the scab is gone, and a new layer of skin appears underneath.
Yeah. So basically the body repairs itself. You get the clot, underneath the body repairs itself. And when
in this case, no, on this on your skin, yes, that happens.
And then the clot falls away, and you've then got a perfect piece of skin. So you don't even, you know, in most cases you won't even see a scar.
Yes.
There's a slightly different mechanism in the endothelial system, though.
That's right. Well, partly because you don't have any cells underneath to grow up. There's only one layer of cells, there's nothing else. Also, if the cells grew up from underneath and pushed the blood clot off, it would just travel down the blood vessel to a point where it narrowed enough that it would block it.
Yeah.
So it can't do these things. So it has to have a different process. And what the process is that it covers up the remaining blood clot with a new layer of these cells, which are called, well, the endothelial cells. And then effectively you've got a new layer on top of the blood clot, which means that the blood clot is now lying within your
it's kind of walled in, so the damage is contained and new cells grow the other side of it, so it's kind of walled into the wall now.
Yes, that's right. And then in most cases, for most people, it will be broken down by white blood cells that come into the area and attack it and eat it and get rid of it.
So in the end, something walls it in, then over time it's gradually eaten away, absorbed.
Yes. So that's the fate, I would imagine, of 99.999% of blood clots that happen.
Yeah.
So the repair systems are there and they work very well. Yeah. So the question is, well, why does it then? Why do they then start to grow? Well, the answer is that you create that point. There's a slight area of weakness, and if you've got other things that damage the artery wall at that point again and again, you get repeated episodes at that point. And if that happens rapidly enough, the repair systems start to become overwhelmed. And actually, instead of all of the junk being got rid of, this plaque, which is remnant blood clots, starts to grow and grow. And eventually you have quite a major thickening at that point. And that is the basis of an atherosclerotic plaque, which is the narrowing and the gunk. And of course, you might say, well, I thought you said it was all full of fatty stuff and whatever. Well, when you look at what's actually in a plaque, it contains all the things that were originally can be found in a blood clot.
So something has caused damage to the lining of the cell wall.
Yeah.
And that ends up in a clot. And if all goes well, it basically repairs itself and gets absorbed. So the next obvious question then is, what is causing the damage in the first place?
Well, the thing is to look at, there's no one thing that causes damage. And this is where I sort of said, you don't look at causes, you look at process, and then ask what can trigger the process. So I use an analogy, I don't know if it's a great analogy of the paintwork on a car generally doesn't rust until you scratch it. It's not true of all cars, but nowadays it increasingly is. So until you damage the paintwork, the water doesn't get at the underlying metal, the salt doesn't get at the underlying metal, so you don't get any rust. You can't rust. So you have to first cause damage. So what things can damage a car paintwork? Well, most people could probably think of 100 off the top of their heads. A stone flies up, another car bashes into it, you hit a pillar at the side of the road, you run a shopping trolley into it, the key from you use the key and it scratches it, or whatever, or as I use the analogy.
Multiple things can erode
multiple things can cause the original damage.
Yeah.
So you've got to look and say, well, what sort of things do we know can cause damage? What things have been found to cause damage? Well, for instance, smoking. If you smoke, small particles get into your lungs. A number of them escape, called nanoparticles, escape into your bloodstream. They're particularly toxic to endothelial cells, and they cause them to die. And in fact, you can measure remnants of dead endothelial cells after a healthy volunteer smokes one cigarette.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, well, that's not very good. So clearly, at the same time, obviously, the repair systems actually are fired up. So new endothelial cells or endothelial progenitor cells are produced at the same time. So as you cause the damage, the mechanism for repair is also swinging into action. But obviously, there comes a point, if you smoke 80 cigarettes or 100 cigarettes a day, and you've been doing that for 20 years, I think your repair systems are just to give us a break.
Yeah. Just like if you keep scratching the car and you never repair the paintwork, eventually rust sets into the point where end of car. I've got this image because I remember listening to you on a podcast talking about an alpha sud, and people used to wake up in the morning. They had a car when they went to bed. When they woke up in the morning, there was just a pile of rust where the car used to be.
Italian cars in the 1980s didn't do very well in Scotland. They tended to dissolve, but sharp tinkling sound I believe the Lancia Beta or something was the worst of them all. But in general, yes, you need to damage. And I think that the damage analogy, I sometimes use potholes in the road, that roads are bashed by car tires and ice and rain and whatever. And if the council spend a lot of money repairing them, you're fine. But once they start running out of money, potholes appear and they get bigger and bigger until eventually you've just got bloody great potholes. And of course, the body's not as simplistic as that, but we are running into the same system, which is if the damage just is overwhelming or working faster than the repair, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
If the repair systems are working faster than damage, you're probably fine. And so you've got to look at both ends of it. So if you look at the repair systems and keeping them in good nick, that's a good thing. Of course, the other thing that can cause a problem is if you have a particular propensity to produce big, sticky, difficult to get rid of blood clots, which some people do. So there's a kind of three-stage process. You damage the artery wall, the blood clot forms, the repair systems come in. That's all normal, if you like, although the damage bit you're trying to reduce. So you're looking at things that increase the rate of damage, things that make your blood clots bigger and more difficult to get rid of, and things that interfere with the repair system. Sometimes one thing can do all three simultaneously. Generally, things do one of the three, sometimes two of the three. And so you start looking at various things and say, well, we know that increases the risk of heart disease. What's it doing, if you like? So you could look at, I'd say, smoking is quite easy. Diabetes is another one we know, which is a major problem. And you say, well, how does diabetes cause the same problem? Well, we now know that a raised blood sugar level attacks the protective lining that's on all endothelial cells. It's the same stuff that protects fish. It's called glycocalyx. It's the slippery stuff.
Yeah.
And if that is strong and healthy and repels all borders, your endothelial cells are less likely to get damaged. What diabetes and blood sugar does is it strips this level, thins it down, and makes damage more likely. So we can see diabetes, yep, smoking, yep, just to slip in something up to date, COVID-19 virus. Yeah. What does the COVID-19 virus do? Well, it gets inside cells because it hijacks the receptor mechanisms.
That's what viruses do. Yeah.
That's what all viruses do that can get into your cells. Then multiplies inside your cells. The cells it tends to get into are endothelial cells because they have the particular receptor that it locks onto. Then the virus is within the cells. It's damaging the cells. The immune system starts attacking those cells because they have become the enemy, and you get blood clots throughout the vascular system. And this is quite often if people have severe infection, this is the thing that quite often actually kills people with COVID. So, other viruses have done this too. Influenza does it. And with bacteria infection, if people have now linked periodontal disease to cardiovascular disease. So chronic gum infection, you think, well, how can a chronic gum infection give you heart disease? It's the same process as the bacteria in your gum are releasing what they call exotoxins into your bloodstream. These exotoxins are particularly nasty to your endothelial cells. They cause damage to your endothelial cells. As they die, the blood clots form, the cardiovascular disease is accelerated. So you can look at something like smoking and periodontal disease. Of course, the cholesterol hypothesis has nothing to say on any of these things because it has nothing to do with them. How are they linked together? And that was the linking together that was the thing that I spent a lot of time trying to work out. So you can look at something like cocaine use, which is now known to be—
That's a great example. Yeah.
And cocaine, well, as we know, it destroys the I forgot the name of it, thing between your nose.
The septum.
Yeah. The septum, that's right. Your septum is destroyed and falls out. But that's because it actually, cocaine causes enormous local endothelial damage. It blocks all the blood vessels, causes them to clot, and causes the center of your nose to fall out. So that should give you a clue of what cocaine is doing to the rest of your cardiovascular system. It's really damaging to your endothelium. And it triggers, a lot of people, in the acute phase after having taken cocaine, I think you're something like in that hour 60 times more likely to have a heart attack than at other times. It's really quite brutal stuff. So essentially, it became relatively straightforward. It almost became a game. It's like, well, I know this causes heart disease. Some things are associated with heart disease. How does it do it? Does it damage the endothelium? Yes, it does. Does it cause increased sizes of blood clots to form? Yes, it does. Does it interfere with the repair system? And so you can bring things in that appear utterly unconnected on the face of it.
Yeah.
And then you find they are connected. They're connected to this process at the center of it, which is some people have called the thrombogenic hypothesis. Thrombo meaning blood and blood clotting, sort of, and genic meaning the genesis of. The thrombogenic hypothesis has been around for a long time, but people haven't sort of brought it together maybe quite in this way. Although I was taught by a researcher and cardiologist at Aberdeen, Elspeth Smith, who was the first person to say to me, LDL cannot get through the endothelium in a small group session. I had no idea what LDL was, and I didn't know what the endothelium was, but it sounded kind of important. So I thought I better find out what is she talking about, because it just dinged something in my brain. She was quite right, and in fact, she did a lot of research and wrote very widely saying that basically blood clotting is involved from the very start of heart disease and the creation of the atherosclerotic plaque to its growth, its development, and the final event, which is the final blood clot. And so she kind of worked out the process, but somehow or other, well, not somehow or other, at that time that the statins were coming in big time, and anyone who had a different idea was just basically squashed. So these ideas, and then I've said to other people, the medics, I said, there is nothing here that contradicts what you know apart from the first bit, because the medical profession is quite happy to accept that blood clots forming on already existing plaques, so a blood clot can form in a plaque, not necessarily big enough to block the entire blood vessel, and then you can see the sudden growth of the size of the clot, of the plaque. People who've been scanned over years, the blood clot, the plaque just stays at a certain size, and then all of a sudden it's bigger. Next time you look, it doesn't just gradually enlarge; it jumps. So that jump is the progression of the blood clot forming. So that's accepted. It's also accepted the final event in heart disease is a blood clot. I mean, almost everything we do in heart disease, once someone's had a heart attack, we get rid of the clot, we put in a stent, we pull the clot out, we give anticoagulants, we give long-term anticoagulants. So the association of blood clotting and heart disease is not exactly.
No, that's it's not controversial, is it? It's just the mechanism.
Well, it's the initial mechanism.
The
initial mechanism is exactly the same. It's a blood clot forming in the artery wall, and that's what's triggered. That's what starts it. That's what makes it grow, and that's what finishes it. It's the same process all the way through. Whereas they're saying, no, it's LDL that diffuses into the artery wall to start with. And then everything else happens. And so, well, why not have, to an extent, why have two processes when you can have just one,
Occam's razor, isn't
Occam's razor.
And hypertension.
Yeah. Well, raised blood pressure, clearly, you ask yourself the question why, or I ask myself the question, why do plaques never form in veins? Because the blood pressure is very low in veins. And if you take a vein from the leg and stick it into the heart as a coronary bypass vessel, which is a fairly common operation, it very often will very rapidly develop atherosclerosis. So you say, what's happened to that vein? Well, the only thing that's happened is it's been put in a place with higher blood pressure. There's nothing else that's happened to it. It's not exposed to anything else. It's exactly the same. It's come from the same person. In the leg, no atherosclerosis. Stick it in the heart, lots of atherosclerosis. All right. And the lungs have their own blood system or circulatory system. Blood comes into the right-hand side of your heart, is pumped out the right-hand side of your heart into your lungs, and then goes from your lungs into your left-hand side of your heart, where it goes around the rest of your body. You don't get plaques in your lungs either. You can, but it's very rare. But only when the blood pressure is raised quite significantly in the lungs. Pulmonary hypertension.
Yeah.
And the blood pressure in your lungs is normally about 20/80, whereas in the rest of your blood system, it's about 120/80. So it's way down. It's a tenth. It's like a fifth, a tenth. And so it's clear that the blood pressure, as it gets higher, is causing greater stress on your endothelial cells by definition, and particularly at the points where the blood vessels branch. Because at these branch points, you get turbulence. So I said in the book, I liken it to white water sort of cascading down a mountain river, and turning boulders over with the force as it goes by. Whereas once you get down to veins, it's like it's like in a in a plane at the bottom of the, where the
Gently floating by.
delta plane, and the streams are meandering gently, so there's hardly any pressure on it. So raised blood pressure at high levels is a risk factor for an increased risk of heart disease. That is, of course, I think, relatively inarguable. It's not maybe as a huge risk as you'd imagine, but it's definitely there. So yes, hypertension is a risk factor, and you can see how that linking in the same way. And it explains to an extent why you see plaques in certain places. Why do you most commonly get plaques in your heart, for example, the arteries in your heart? Because your heart is beating continuously, 70 times a minute. And as you can imagine, the blood vessels on it are getting squashed and squidged and mangled back and forward. In fact, they're squeezed shut when the heart contracts. There's such a pressure on the vessels, they're squeezed closed. So that you get no circulation in the heart when the heart's contracting. When the heart relaxes, that the blood actually can circulate in the heart. And so as the rest of the body is getting, as it contracts, that's when they get the circulation. But in the heart, actually, when it relaxes, is when the circulation occurs, because the blood vessels are under such mechanical stress all the time. And the other common place to get plaque is in the neck. It's called the carotid arteries, and this is another place where the blood pressure is coming straight up the heart. It's very high, and you can get quite nasty plaques here, and the plaque can break off and travel. In this case, plaque don't break off. Sometimes you get a clot, breaks off and travels into your brain. So you can see again how, I think you can see how blood pressure relates to smoking, relates to diabetes, relates to periodontal disease, and on and on and on. So it's almost like very intellectually satisfying, and you say, oh, I can see how these. I think I can now see how they all fit together. Yeah.
I'm sensing a bit of a theme here. So we've kind of given lots of examples, and I guess we could play this where I'd run out of ideas, but you could probably play this game all night, which is to name yet another cause and explain it by the same mechanism. But I think we've made the principle. Are there any other really major causes? I mean, there's lots of other examples you give in the book, but do you think we've done sufficient on that for now?
Well, I think the other one that obviously I covered, and my big thing, was what we call stress, or psychological stress, or psychological upset. And I think that's a less absolutely direct route. But if you are chronically stressed and your stress system, your stress hormones, what they call the sympathetic system, are constantly on alert, this does several things. It releases stress hormones, which cause your blood vessels to contract. It raises your blood pressure. The stress hormones themselves interfere with repair systems in your body. Drugs like hormones like cortisol, that are part of your stress system, are actually directly antagonistic to insulin, and so they raise your blood sugar levels, and etc. etc. So and your blood is more ready to clot. So with psychological stress or chronic psychological stress, you've got increased endothelial damage, increased blood clots, or blood clots that form more readily, more difficult to get rid of, and your repair systems are hampered or reduced. So people who are chronically stressed, depression, anxiety, some of the significant mental disorders such as schizophrenia. I mean, the average age of death with schizophrenia is 48. And primarily due to cardiovascular disease, and they often develop diabetes, etc., etc. So they have a significant cardiometabolic. So I think that's the other, in my view, the other biggie, if you like, is the psychosocial, psychological stress, whatever you call it, and it causes other forms of damage as well. But this is really important.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more, please join our Facebook group, and don't forget to subscribe and follow so you don't miss the next episode. Maybe share as well to friends and family who might also benefit. And if you think you need some help with diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, or reducing risk of stroke and heart disease, then do book a free consultation with me. There's absolutely no charge for this. You can ask lots of questions, and we will never put you under any pressure. What do you have to lose? Thanks, and bye for now.